Hello, everyone, and welcome to 180 Degrees of Impact. Erik, how's it going?
Things are excellent. I cannot complain.
All right, thanks for coming. I have Erik Douds, who I would describe as a man of many, many trades and many, many experiences. Erik, how do you describe yourself, or could you introduce yourself to the broader audience?
I've been describing myself as a global traveler and endurance athlete with type 1 diabetes. So I have been to every continent besides Antarctica, and I've been a type 1 diabetic since the age of 16. So that is usually how I introduce myself to people.
Awesome. Yeah, yeah. So, I'll mention that I know you, of course, through being a classmate at Seton Hall Prep, but you have an interesting story, which I know you've told to many, many people worldwide. Um, so, I'd love if you could recap that. How did you first? What was your experience first like when you found out you were type 1 diabetic?
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting having you since you're actually there in the beginning moments. But I guess taking it back a little bit, I had a pretty normal upbringing in terms of going to elementary school, living my life, playing soccer, doing stuff like that, and just having my childhood. And it was only until I was a sophomore at high school that all of a sudden I actually started losing a lot of weight. So I entered the beginning of the year, and everyone said, "Douds, you're so skinny," which was like an interesting comment because I'm always skinny. I've always been a slim person, but I ended up losing about 15 pounds in 2 weeks. And so I ended up at the doctor, and that's where I was diagnosed with type 1. And so it was really something that overnight my life completely changed. You're living your life, hit 16, hit this moment, and then from there on out, I was diagnosed with a disease that currently has no cure. So it was learning a whole new routine, learning how to adjust, and that's where I can show you at least this one. That's my, so I wear an insulin pump on my arm. And so you learn how to adjust and learn about your blood sugars, and you have to readjust in life, but a lot of us kind of have those moments. So mine just happened to come at 16.
Mhm. Yeah, I think one thing that is super interesting to me about your story is uh, it's not even just that part of the story. No offense.
No worries.
The part of like how you've decided to uh, react to being part of the T1D community, whether that is by raising money or by starting Diabetes Abroad today. But yeah, I'd love if you could talk about like, the moments after. What actually motivated you to, I'll say, pick yourself up and to, do things that were beneficial for the community rather than just kind of doing what you had to do for your own health.
Yeah, I think I actually remember being in the hospital bed, and I think the prospect of having something my entire life really shifted things. So I said, I'm going to be living with this thing my entire life. I can either be bitter about it or I can be optimistic and do something positive about it. So when I was 17, I started raising money at Seton Hall Prep, and before I kind of knew it, the community came together and rallied around it, and I started a foundation to help provide all the education materials when someone's newly diagnosed. And then like the Lions Club got on part of it. Costco was supporting it at the time, and it really like evolved into something where I only had like a little spark of an idea. I started off saying, wow, I'm so lucky to have doctors and a medical team and all the support around me to adjust to this disease. I want to make a small contribution to. I am now talking about how do I manage funds for a nonprofit. So that was like incredible to see. And I think as I moved on with life, there was a lot of opportunities I still saw. So when I went to college, I thought there was a lot of issues with how diabetics manage the college experience. And then traveling around the world, there's time after time of saying, wow, I'm in this new country. How do they manage it? But then how do I manage it? And then doing stuff like backpacking New Zealand for about a month. How do I bring this along? But really it's about how do you continue your passions and live your passions to the fullest and bring this other part with you. And so it's really about overcoming fears that a lot of people have, and then actually providing some practical tips and resources, kind of learn from my mistakes so people don't do them as well.
Yeah.
And having a lot of fun along the way.
Awesome. Yeah, it seems like you're having a lot of fun along the way. It's one thing I want to take a step back to is with high school, with college, you're dealing with a bunch of young people who don't know the first thing about type 1 diabetes or about diabetes in general. What was that like? Like, what were some of the misconceptions that you encountered at the time where you were like, no, here's what's actually happening with me and my life and my health?
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's high school and rumors spread insanely quick. So I was in the hospital, I think, for 5 days. And so I came back late afternoon on a Friday. And I remember coming into school and people being like, Douds, I thought you were kicked out for drugs. Like, I thought you were a drug dealer or something like that. And so in my world, I'm like lying in a hospital bed, adjusting to this completely new lifestyle. And on the other side, people like the stories just spiral out of control so quickly. So that's like, it was crazy to see that. But then this overall, I mean, a lot of things we meet every single day is, you know, I tell people I'm a diabetic and they go, oh, you don't look like one. Oh, like, oh, do you eat a lot of sugar? So you have a lot of those misconceptions where it's just a genetic disease that can happen to anyone. It happened to happen to me at 16. And so you have a lot of, you have to redefine what the disease looks like to people and realize, hey, it affects like so many different people in so many different ways. And so that's the way the community is now coming together and saying, hey, this is the face of being a type 1 diabetic. It's everyone. It's so you never know who has it.
Yeah. How have you gone about like educating people though to make sure that they are more aware? I keep thinking of like someone like me who wouldn't know the first thing about type 1 diabetes. How have you made sure that how have you created awareness within your community?
So I guess I'll tell like a short story. So there's a time where I was home, I think in between trips, and I was sitting down on my couch. My dad walked in and he was just talking to me. And then all of a sudden he says, Erik, I think you use diabetes to go above and beyond what's normal and expected in life. And I think that's pretty true, is that I've always seen this as a huge challenge. You know, it's a big community where people are told what they can't do, or they say, you now have all these restrictions. And so I was never a marathon runner. Just on Sunday, I did a triathlon, the New York City Triathlon. I'm now biking across America. I was hiking in New Zealand. So it's a lot of stuff where your average person wouldn't do it. And I think the disease helped motivate me of saying, hey, normally people tell you can't do this, you can't do that. And I'm saying, do this and go way above what's expected of you. Because if you do that, people begin to start meeting you halfway. You know, so when I do a marathon, friends start doing 5Ks and 10Ks. And when I start doing a triathlon, my dad did a triathlon, and other friends did triathlons. And so I think that's how you redefine a larger issue, is saying, I'll be an example, and I try to be as bold as possible. So like, I try to wear my stuff on I can't tell if you can see it, but there's legitimately a dinosaur on my arm. So I try to be like bold about it. And that's something that takes time and courage to overcome. I'd say initially you feel very shy about it, and then eventually you realize I should be bold about this, and then people will understand what you have, and then hopefully will follow suit.
Are there other people who you meet, who whatever it is that they're dealing with, who are struggling to find that like courage to do things and to really live?
Yeah, I mean, you hear so many stories. Like, there's a kid who was once telling me that in his school, he would lift up the panels on the bathroom, you know, the ceiling tiles, and hide all of his diabetic stuff up there. You know, so there's stuff that I would never even consider doing, but then you start hearing the stories, and that's why I think you have to, that's one of the beauties of the internet, is people are now able to connect in new ways. But you also have like summer camps where kids are connecting, and you have all these other situations where people start to see oh, there's other living with this disease and others that have similarities. And so we can come out and be normal, be who we are, and not hide it from other people. I think a lot of people start off very shy, and that's totally normal, because if you could imagine being a teenager, you already have so many things going on. And then all of a sudden you're a kid who's taking shots with a syringe, or you're wearing these new devices. And so you look like you clearly stand out, and that, obviously can drive people to be intimidated or want to hide it from as many people as possible.
Yeah. What's the advice that you have for those kids who are like really feel really limited and held back, not just by what they're going through, but also by what they think they might go through when it comes to the societal pressures? What do you tell those people, other than just living your life and being who you are?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most helpful thing for me is I was diagnosed when I was 16. So, like, I know what quote unquote normal life is like, and I know what life is like after it. And so I think some of the best things is really finding that friend, like a best friend that can be there with you. And so there's a lot of stuff, like a lot of my races and a lot of these things I've done with someone else. And I think that's always helped. It's like you don't always have to go through everything by yourself. You can bring other people along, and there's always people that will be there to support you. And then the other side is that there's so many communities that now exist where you can reach out and find someone that, even online, there's people I talk to. Like, there's people I keep up with on Snapchat and Instagram, and before you feel super isolated, and then you see like, wow, there's all these people doing all these super cool things who are, playing soccer and doing all this stuff. And that's like what helps inspires you and gets you over, because there's a huge emotional side of this disease as well. I think that's when you have a community that can get you through like the low points, and so then you can find more of the high points and kind of shoot for like bigger dreams.
Awesome. I'm definitely going to encourage you to name names. So shout out some of your biggest supporters and your inspirations too. Who are some of those people?
So I'd say, since you know him, James Sanchez, he was a high school friend that him and I legitimately went from, he asked me to train him for a 5K, and then in 9 months we did the Copenhagen Marathon together. So that was someone where we did one lap around a park and like was exhausted, and then did a marathon. So that's just like true endurance, true inspiration to me personally. But then like in the diabetic world, like Lauren Bongiorno, she's a yoga instructor, like always being super active. One of my close friends, we go hiking and do yoga in Central Park, stuff like that. And then Erik, he started the Diabetes Sports Project, which I'm an ambassador for. And so he just wanted a collaboration of all athletes with diabetes who are doing marathons and Ironmans and really pushing the disease and like sports to a new level. And I just love the way he approaches kind of life. And he's all about bringing people together to compete together. But then also having like events before and after races so people can meet the athletes and ask all those questions. And I mean, I think there's like a list of people that I'm always just checking in on Instagram and seeing what they're up to.
So I guess people should check out who you're following on Instagram in order to figure out who they should check out, basically.
Pretty much. I always am inspired by people where you can usually see who they were beforehand and then went through a big transformation. Because for myself, I never really considered myself an athlete. It was something that started way later in life. And so I've always appreciated, like for instance, last year was the first time I did a triathlon. And at the age of 25 was the first time I bought swim goggles and a swim cap and like asked people, how do I do laps in the pool? So I think a big issue I had with myself was that a lot of times you're told you're not an athlete or you're told you're not certain things. And then I realized that people can change at any point in life. So I've always appreciated those stories of saying, hey, I was 50 years old and overweight, and now I do Ironmans as a 60-year-old. So people that do stuff like that, I think, are the most inspirational.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I think one thing that's really awesome about what you're doing is that you are, well, there are a lot of things that are really awesome about what you're doing, but it's so cool to me that I heard about Diabetes Abroad on World Diabetes Day last year in November, middle of November, and you've done so much since then. It's kind of mind blowing to think about. It's like you're doing more than a lot of experienced, seasoned national nonprofits are doing with their time, and I really appreciate that. Could you talk more about like why you specifically decided to found that community and what you're up to now? Because I know it's evolved in a really surreal, awesome way where you're all over the country, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think why, so I started Diabetes Abroad on World Diabetes Day last year, and that came from my background in traveling. I've been traveling since I was a teenager, but then my background's environmental policy. So I've been all over the world, and I think there's a real beauty of travel in terms of seeing new cultures and really the experience about learning. You learn about others to learn about yourself. And for me, I wanted to show that this is like a global disease, that it affects every part of the world. And so one of the goals of Diabetes Abroad is to create one of the largest travel maps. So all user submitted photos of trying to get a photo from every single country and then every single state in the US, and just saying, hey, we're everywhere, so why can't you go somewhere? And then really making sure that people have an example of saying, if I want to go to Africa, if I want to go to Europe, if I want to leave the home, like there are other people doing it, so there's no reason I can't. So that's one of the overall just like goals of the community. And then I hope to touch on larger issues. So saying, how do people in South America deal with the disease? How do people in Europe deal with it? How do people in Canada deal with it versus the US or something like that? And realize some of the issues that happen on a global scale, to kind of highlight some things that are happening in our community, hopefully, lead to change. It's really what it's about.
One thing that struck me about what you were saying is that you said that you learn about others to learn about yourself, which is so powerful. That's a huge part of, for me, what I'm doing with 180 Degrees of Impact. I'm super curious, what have you learned through this process? I'm sure it's been a lot.
Yeah, where do I want to begin? I can talk about my most recent trip. So I'm currently biking across America, and so I've made it as far as Denver, Colorado, so about 2,100 miles. And I flew back to New York for the New York City Triathlon. And I think what I've learned the most about this country is that when you meet people face to face, is that there's still so much kindness and that people always want to help out. So every single day, we're looking for shelter, we're looking, for food and all this stuff, and people have been super interested in our story and have always been asking more questions. So I think that's been a really incredible journey of, okay, what does our nation look like and how are people feeling? And then when you have like so much that's happening on the internet where you kind of feel like people are always bullying each other, you hear like cyberbullying and all this kind of negativity, and then you go out and engage the world, like people are still so nice. And that's been like the biggest surprise, I would say. It's kind of like weird that that's a surprise, but it has been. And that's what's been incredible. It's like people hear about this once in a lifetime trip, and so they want to be part of it in the smallest way possible, whether it's hosting us for the night or offering us a meal or just like talking to us. So that's been truly like incredible to experience.
Who are some of the interesting people you've met, though?
So in the border of Missouri and Kansas, I was told there's someone that was restoring an opera house. And so this was, you kind of hear how small town America is fading away. And this was someone who was retired in the Navy, who was living in Seattle and then ended up in the Midwest again. And there was a historic opera house that actually had a segregated opera for whites, and then a floor above it had a separate opera for black only. And so it was really, to him, like a really important historic landmark. And so what they were doing was putting a cafe on the first floor, developing an art gallery, using a space for a tech company. And then his greater, like, grand vision was to make this small town, like, a destination for retirees and also for weddings. So there's like a lake in town, there's a college education. And so it was someone that was saying, hey, I'm retired. What else am I supposed to do with my life? Why can't I use some of my money to invest and build a business and bring a town back and bring retirees who love art and who want to go back to those passions, but then also teach millennials and have it go both ways. And I thought that was like a really beautiful story. And Jack ended up like putting me up in his house overnight and just talking to me. So I thought that was a really touching story of retirees are a new source of inspiration and flames and also financial backing. And they can teach millennials and millennials can teach them. And I thought that was like a beautiful story that could be replicated across America.
I'll ask I have a really broad question, but this just came up, and I think for you, like considering what you have experienced in your life, whether that's your diagnosis or your interactions with people, how has that affected your worldview?
I think anyone that experiences their life changing overnight, which is a surprising amount of people, I think they have an appreciation for how short things are. And so when I was diagnosed at 16, that was the first time where I said, my health is not a guarantee. I'm happy to have an option to continue to be healthy, but it was the first time where I said, whoa, like this is not guaranteed. And that's why I have been driven to do so much. And so when you're in that community, you then can relate and have a lot of empathy for other people. So when you say, whether it's, I've had a boss that's passed away from leukemia, or it's someone who's in the middle of America or anything, it's like, in some capacity, I can relate to you because I realize that things are very short and not everyone has that perspective on life. Yeah. Say I didn't have that perspective until it was like, whoa, I'm in a hospital and my life is going to be changed forever. And so I think that's what motivates some people to say, hey, I want to invite as many people as possible into my home as possible. Like, I want to have as many people come into my home because I've traveled and I've maybe not had a home in the past, where other people say, I had this certain thing, like I've broken my leg. Like Casey Neistat's a huge YouTuber that I love following. And he says at the age of 27, like he was in a motorcycle accident. The doctor said he would never walk again. And then he ended up doing like Ironmans, So I think a lot of people that you see incredible drive in, a lot of times there's a story behind that of, hey, something happened to me at some point. So I think that's a perspective I'll always have in life. And you also see it in a lot of individuals.
So as one of my last questions, I really want to know, what's your story? That last sentence was very, very powerful. And I could only imagine one day you will have a book. I know you'll have a book one day, probably pretty soon, or a documentary about you. What would the title of that be and why? Or what are some of the potential titles and why?
I think it depends if it's a segment of a journey or like an overall thing. One of the goals or a title, like how to visit every continent with diabetes is something I would love to write. I'd love to talk about the transition that happens every time you travel. So you have the culture shock, you have all these adjustments, and I'd love to explore that. And then also teach people, here's how you travel, here's how you go around the world. But then there's other moments where I'd love to take a segment of a journey, like biking across America, and write either, may all just be a chapter of a larger thing. But having, the coast to coast journey, or I was telling you before, when I was in Ethiopia, we slaughtered an ox. So having something that's, shocking and that would draw people in would definitely be an interest to me. But I think how to travel the world with diabetes is always on my mind, and hopefully I'll be developing it.
Yeah, I'm sure that you will write that book and publish that book. When do you think it's going to come out, by the way, when you actually publish it?
I think if I sat down I hope you'll see it next year. At the beginning of next year, I'd love to see. I would love to, if it is truly roughed out, then I guess next year for World Diabetes Day. But I think even before that, I would love to at least have something small that people can put their hands on and slip into their pocket as they travel.
Yeah. Well, you clearly have an incredible resolve to actually make things happen. So I feel like I'll start searching Amazon in January for your book, and hopefully it's not too expensive or anything. Maybe
You'll get the first copy.
A free signed copy.
After my mom gets a copy, I'll send one to you.
Okay, I guess that's fine. But as we wrap up, so where can people find you and Diabetes Abroad and anything you're passionate about on the internet?
Of course, I'd say diabetesabroad.com is the best platform for all the journeys and everything happening. Right now on Instagram, I'm probably the most active. So Erik, that's Erik, and then my last name is Douds, Douds. That's probably the best way to find me on social media. And yeah, and then so I have a newsletter and the blog, and that's definitely the best way to keep up with all the adventures. And I encourage anyone that has travel photos that happens to be a diabetic to submit them so we can keep building out the travel map.
And for those who want to learn more about 180 Degrees of Impact, just visit www.lets.care or on Twitter @letsyoucare, facebook.com/letsyoucare. And then you can find me somewhere in there, Matt Scott. You'll find me. I'm there. But thanks again, Erik, for joining in.
Oh, thank you, Matt. Always appreciate talking to you.
Awesome. And for everyone else who is watching, until next time, keep impacting.